Good morning. So this is Mr. Wright, and we're doing our photography exposure review worksheet. I'm going to walk you through it and try to explain as many of the questions as I can. It's not supposed to be a surprise. It's not a trick. I want you to be able to learn this stuff as we go through it. So just for recording purposes, if everyone knows, we have a class going on right now. So I'm doing this live with a group of students, which I'm going to give a hard time because I told them to put their faces on the screens and reposition their cameras accordingly. Find a book, find something you can place your camera on so I can see you and see how things are going. Not to throw people under the bus, but there are a few of you that all I can see is your roof. So figure it out. I'm sure you can tip your camera enough so I can see your face, so I can see if you're paying attention. Or if you're dancing, because that's also cool too, to know that people are really paying attention. Alrighty, here we go. So first things first, we're going to jump. If you're doing this with me, it has probably been assigned in Google Classroom. So you're going to need to jump into your Google Classroom, find the assignment marked as Photography Exposure Review, and your worksheet that you are going to find in Google Docs should look something very similar to this. So it is very, very simply the basics of aperture, shutter speed, ISO, and how those three relate to exposure as it relates to photography. We oftentimes, I am going to put myself on the screen here. Let's see here. Oh, that's too big. Let's go here. Number 4. That'll work. Let's make me in a different location though. We will put it down here. And we'll make it just a bit bigger. Try that. Perfect. There we go. So you can see me talking and you can see the document as we go through it. I think I can actually make this a little bit bigger for every... Oh, that made it smaller. Let's go bigger. There we go. Close this. Alrighty, here we go. So, I think there's actually a way that I can do this as a full screen. Aha. Gets rid of some of the junk at the top. Okay, so photography exposure worksheet, really specifically just to define a few terms and stuff, right? So please answer the following questions or fill in the blanks with the best possible answers in your own words. Please understand this is as much a learning tool for you as it is an assignment for me. And I mean for me in terms of you're handing me in assignment, not an assignment for me. Copying a bunch of random stuff that you don't understand will not help you, but writing the simplified version in your own words hopefully will bring greater understanding. I have set it up to have copyright protection set up in this assignment, so if you just copy and paste a bunch of junk from Google that's not what I said and not my way of teaching this or doing this, you will not get full marks. I will discount your mark based on if it sounds like gibberish from a computer that you just copy and pasted from some website, or if it actually sounds like you understand what you're talking about. Note the term photograph refers to either physical photos that you have taken, that you took a picture of, or digital photos that you found online, or actual photos you took digitally. There's a bunch of different ways to get photos this day and age. There is one question, question 20, the very end. You must take the photos yourself. The rest, if you find them online or you find them as a previously taken photo, that will be sufficient. I will 100% let you hand those in. So, first question, describing the term aperture in your own words. For me, aperture is basically the description of what is happening in our camera lenses. We have an aperture. It is basically a cylindrical kind of set of baffles, and if I had an old camera here, if we were at the school, I would be able to show you how those baffles open and close. Essentially, the concept of aperture is that we are either letting in more light by opening up the aperture or stopping down the amount of light, so using the term called f-stop to create a smaller opening and let in less light into our camera. So The two aspects of aperture that can be used to create artistic or interesting images is that aperture specifically can be used. I'm just going to double check my notes, make sure I'm talking about the right thing. Yes. So for aperture specifically, you have the ability to create a narrow depth of field or a wide depth of field, or some people call it a small or large depth of field, but basically aperture controls that aspect. It also controls things with regards to the amount of light that's coming into your camera. So one of the two aspects is obviously depth of field. The other creative artistic aspect would be the amount of light, specifically when it comes to flash photography. Aperture is what controls flash intensity. In the world of flash and the world of ambient light, there are two different things. So shutter speed controls your ambient light. Aperture controls your flash light. The speed of flash is instantaneous, right? It's super fast. So we actually can't control that with the shutter speed, because the shutter speed 9 times out of 10 opens much slower than the speed of light, right? The speed of light is 3 point whatever billion miles an hour kind of thing, right? So it is pretty much instantaneous. So aperture allows us to tone down or increase the amount of flash intensity or light intensity. When we're not using a flash, it still increases or decreases the amount of light that's getting into an image. And in turn, having a smaller or larger aperture creates a smaller or larger depth of field. Now, it is the weirdest, screwiest thing. It is what we consider an inverse relationship. So aperture, the numbers are described with regards to f-stop. So as we increase the f-stop, so we go from an f, say 2.8 to an f22, we're actually going from a very large hole at f2.8, so not very much stopping force, and we're bringing it down to f22, which is basically like a tiny little pinhole of light coming through. What that does inversely is the smaller the hole, actually the greater the depth of field. So the more stuff becomes in focus with regards to aperture. And the reverse is true. The larger our aperture, so if we're using an f2.8 or 1.8, we're going to have a super tiny little aperture amount of stuff in focus. And that depth of field, I should have mentioned this before, but that controls what's in focus in your photo, right? So it's not just what you can see in the photo, but it's specifically what is identifiably sharp in the photo, that depth of field. And you can shift that depth of field using your focal ring on your camera, whether you want to focus on something that's near, medium, far. We already did some assignments like this before Christmas with regards to depth of field. Okay. You're going to, obviously we're going to skip over the questions that have you guys needing to take photos and stuff. You're going to do those in a little bit. So you're going to take 4 photos. They're going to show how aperture affects depth of field in a creative way. So you can find some photos that have super narrow, short, small depth of field with a big, huge bokeh in the background, right? I'm going to show you a couple right now. I'm going to have some fun with this camera and see if we can get it to work here. Let's see, undo this. Well, you know what? We're going to leave it on this tripod because it was hard to get on the tripod to begin with. So we're going to do quick play, show, actually we'll keep me in the corner, and we'll do this here. That will bring up the live view on this camera. Here we go. So this is a Canon 80D camera right now. You can see your guys' class on my extra monitor. as well. I'm going to turn this into a bit of a monopod here so that it can sit. I have this lovely potted plant that I got my wife to bring down from upstairs for us to take some pictures of. Okay, so depth of field, in a nutshell, allows me to take pictures of a lot of different things. Now, one of the things that often gets forgotten when we're talking about depth of field and aperture and shutter speed is that, and it's the last question on this worksheet, I'm not 100% certain why I left it till the very end, but it's this terminology called the exposure triangle. So for now, we're going to assume that I know how to use the exposure triangle. We'll kind of recap things at the end and do some definitions with regards to that specifically. But, oh, you guys can't hear a word I'm saying. Oh, yeah, you can. Can you hear me? Yeah, everyone can hear me? Do I have some thumbs up? Yes? Everybody can hear me? Okay, perfect. I freaked out for a second there. I looked at the screen and there's sound that comes from this camera, but it was turned down, which is a good thing because it would be all weird and foggy and fuzzy and stuff. So, anyways, we're going to assume that I know the exposure triangle, and we're also going to let the camera, we're going to put it on ISO auto so that the camera chooses the proper exposure and helps us out a little bit. We're going to focus specifically on aperture. So on our cameras, we're going to set it. Now, you don't have to follow along with me right now. You can do this later, but I am going to set it to aperture priority. I'm in video mode. Let's go into photo mode here. So on this camera, AV priority. So I have the option to go into manual, AV, TV, right? So I'm going to go into AV priority. So I'm the one controlling the aperture. The camera will figure out the rest for the shutter speed and all that kind of stuff. Right now it is set to f14, which is definitely not what I want. Actually, maybe we'll start with f14. So at f14, and we are going to go to 1, if we can. Let's see here, f14. It's going to want to do an 8-second exposure. What is it doing? All right. Actually, I'm going to change this so that it knows it is allowed to. I'm just going to tell it that it can go to the max setting. So we have our lovely plant here. I'm going to put it on autofocus for a second. So there's our potted plant. If I chose to take, now if I had a macro lens, this would be a little bit easier and I would have a better result. And I will change to a macro lens so you guys can see the difference. But generally, if we go like this, I'm actually going to do manual focus. So I can focus on the first little bit of the plant here. And at f14, it's going to want a 6-second exposure. This thing is crazy. Okay, well, I'm going to have to put the legs of this tripod out. Hang on a second. I cannot hold this and do a 6-second exposure. That would be a little crazy. Again, this is one of the things where lighting is key to anything that we are doing in photography. There we go. So, in focus, click our exposure, right? So, we have, zoom this in, we have quite a bit of focus at the front, but we also have some focus at the back. We have focus in surrounding elements of the photo. So by using an f14, we actually have a fairly wide range of items that are in focus. If I stop this down, hang on, what's going on if I go down to f2.8, we are going to again focus just on the front of this flower. Okay, so if you compare this one now, I have focus basically straight away on the front couple flower petals, but as soon as we get over here, these are quite blurry in comparison to the previous photo. So if I go back, so f14 gets me the vast majority of the plant in focus. If I went to f22, I'd probably get even more, whereas f2.8, the background is completely blown out. So I get, and the term is called bokeh or bokeh or whatever you want to, however you want to pronounce it. It's kind of fun. But that sort of concept allows you to have very artistic photos, but also from a storytelling standpoint, you may not want such a detailed focus. You want to see the vast scene, right? So that relationship between aperture and shutter speed, which should be given priority, depends on what you're trying to do, right? If I want to have, for example, like a really fast action shot of somebody running, shutter speed is my main priority. I'm going to need to use a very fast shutter speed to make sure that I get it in focus and there's not a bunch of motion blur. If I want to do a more artistic, creative, like focal plane, depth of field photo like this, if you notice, I'm using a tripod. It's shooting, I'll put myself out of the way for a second here. It is shooting at 1/100th of a second at f2, and at when I was at, oops, hang on, where did we go? When I was at f11, I was all, or f14, excuse me, I was all the way down to 1/8 of a second. So very, very slow in terms of like being able to handhold the camera, right? You wouldn't be able to do that with a camera. So let's go full screen and we'll bring this back up actually here. Okay, so you're going to take /find 4 photographs. You're going to explain them, why you think the depth of field technique was used in each photo. And then when it relates to why or when you'd use shutter speed priority versus aperture priority and why one would be more important than the other, it's because am I doing artistic aperture, I want to control what's in focus type of photos, so I would use aperture as my main priority, or I would put that higher on the triangle, or if I want something to be fast action, quickly found, quickly caught, excuse me, I'm going to need to use the shutter speed as my priority. So moving right along, question 6, it says what are common aperture / f-stop associated with the following types of photos? So single detail, like we said, that narrow depth of field, very soft focus on the background, you're going to be using an f like 2.8 to f4, for example, would get you that really narrow single detail set of focus, okay, or that type of photo. When we're talking a snapshot, your standard photograph, we're talking like f8, f11, somewhere in there. Most cameras, I know that our school cameras, they shift focus from 3.4 to 5.6. So those are kind of the standard. Anything over that f4 range is usually the standard sort of snapshot photo, right? But that's with the assumption that you're not taking a landscape, because if you're taking a landscape photo, I would highly recommend a higher aperture. So we're talking like an f14, f16, f22, somewhere in that range, because it's going to allow the entire scene to be in focus, or at least clear-ish. Obviously the extreme background and possibly the extreme foreground may or may not be in focus, but you should have good detail throughout the image with using a higher aperture. Just by show of hands, does that make sense so far? Are we following? Everything's, I mean, I'm sure I'm going really fast, and I know you can recover a little bit. Okay, so a few of you maybe didn't give me the quite thumbs up I was expecting, which is okay. One thing I will say specifically about Aperture is that it's often my go-to priority when I am taking photos and stuff, specifically for portraits, and where I'm wanting that single focus, and I don't want the shutter. If I have a tripod and I have stuff set up, we're good to go, right? But if I'm taking landscapes and stuff, I would often I would want to make sure that I'm doing it in manual because I like that control. If I'm doing action shots, obviously I'm going to be in shutter speed priority because I need to make sure that the camera, no matter what the exposure is, it's still fast and it doesn't slow down. So oftentimes when I'll send cameras with kids to take photos of events and stuff, I'll put it in shutter speed priority because then we can maximize our sharpness, and if it's a little underexposed or whatever, we'll just have to live with that, and we can always try to brighten it up in post. But we can't sharpen it as well in post as we can lighten it as in post. So just some things to think about with regards to that. So to finish out that sort of category of depth of field, you're going to take or find 2 more photos and make sure you label them, whether they're narrow depth of field, wide depth of field, whatever that might be. So you're going to describe in your own words what shutter sheep is. That's cute. I guess I should fix that. Hang on. This is not your. This is speed. But this is not in your document. On your guys' documents, feel free to fix shutter sheep and turn it into shutter speed. That's kind of funny. I could get a lot of interesting definitions with that one. But anyways, so shutter speed is the speed at which your shutter opens and closes. Only problem is camera companies went and came out with cameras like this that are mirrorless cameras that they don't have a defined shutter. So this is a Canon. It's an M50. Apparently it's getting discontinued soon. I kind of like it, the small form factor, but I think Canon is hating the fact that they have small lenses and medium lenses and bigger lenses, and they don't all fit on each other, and it's a little bit confusing. So with regards to shutter speed, it is generally by definition the amount of time, or like that, it's defining that sort of function, if you will, of how long the shutter opens and closes to allow light to come into the camera. It directly controls your ambient light. It has almost no control over shutter speed. Now, or excuse me, flash light. Light coming from a flash of any kind, whether it's the flash on the camera or whether it's an external flash that you might be using, it does almost nothing with regards to flash intensity. It completely controls ambient light, though. Obviously, it works in conjunction with ISO and aperture. That's why we call it the exposure triangle. But specifically, shutter speed is that time for how long the sensor is exposing to light and how short, for example. In this camera, in this DSLR camera, the 80D, I think I can show it here. If I set this up right, I should be able to put me in the big window, this in the small window. So right now, I'm gonna just pull the lens off so you can see inside. So if I set the shutter speed, it's gonna give me a hard time right now. I gotta put it in manual mode. Well, actually, bulb mode would be better. So if I have it in bulb mode, it allows me to control how fast the shutter speed is. So I can quickly hit it. Oh, it's on a timer, of course. Hang on a second. Who sets their bulb mode on a timer? So I can quickly hit the trigger and take fast photos, or I can open that shutter up, let lots of light get into the sensor, and when I let go, the picture you're going to see should be almost white. I don't see why. I don't know why it's not showing you guys what the picture would look like. It'd be completely white with a quick shutter speed, right? Or slow, I should say. And if I go long or a quicker shot, I'm just confusing this poor camera because it has no lens on it. It doesn't know what's going on. Anyways, hopefully you get the idea. Long shutter speed. Oh man, that's kind of cool. Anyways, it's just very confused. It wants a lens on it. There we go. So, anyways, you'd have that ability, right? Actually, I could probably even do it here now with the lens on. Let's go autofocus. So in bulb mode, take a quick shot. It's basically black. There's nothing there even. The photo is oh no, it's pretty good. I can't actually go very fast with my finger, so it's pretty much right, sort of in the right exposure. If I hold it down, that same kind of photo is now going to look quite a bit differently. It should be almost completely white, right? So haven't changed anything, didn't change any settings, just changed the shutter speed. So I let in more ambient light and allowed it to be completely whited out here. So this camera, of course, middle of my demo is going to die. Why not? That just adds to the fun of teaching. So we'll go back to here. So I think that answers 8 and 9, how light and stuff affects. So question 10 is take or find 4 photos that demonstrate how shutter speed controls the effects of motion in a photo. So I'm going to do a little motion demo, but I'm going to quickly, or try to quickly, if I can, just swap this battery out because it's going to die here if I'm not careful. So take a 2-minute mental break. I'm going to grab the battery off the charger. Whoa. Okay. Trying to get myself too tangled up here. So we're going to ditch this tripod for a second. So one of the things that shutter speed allows you to control or to have fun with, I guess you could say, from an artistic or creative manner, is that concept of motion and adding in motion or taking away motion or whatever you might want to do with your camera. So I'm going to go back to, let's see if this will turn on again for us. There we go. Quick play. So I am going to go into TV priority. So I am in on a Canon. I'm not sure why they call it TV priority, but that's your shutter speed priority. I think on a Nikon it says shutter speed priority, or has a S or something. Anyways, this allows me to set my shutter speed, and then the camera will deal with the ISO, and the camera will also deal with the aperture accordingly. It's looking for properly exposed photo. It has absolutely no idea whether I'm in focus or not. It's going to try. If I left it in autofocus mode, it would try and focus it. I'm going to turn it to manual focus mode, and I will show you what happens. So ideally, in a perfect scenario, let's see, where's a better place for me? Maybe, no, I guess that's fine. Right now it is shooting in 1/30th of a second. We want to go super fast. So like 1/250th of a second. Even if I'm shaking around like a crazy person, it actually takes a half decent photo, right? It's so fast that it's able to capture or stop most of that motion that I have. So obviously if I was sitting still, you'd get theoretically a very crisp photo. Now there's some grain and stuff added because it's shooting at ISO 6400 and at f2.8, but that aside, it's a in focus blurless photo for the most part. If I do the reverse of that though, and go down to say a 15th of a second, and I move around and I take that photo, now I get this kind of crazy blur thing happening, and you can see very clearly that there's a lot of motion. So if I was tracking a runner, for example, and I wanted to have them, if I could do it and I could match the speed of their run, I would be able to get a cool kind of blurred out background, but have the have this blurry background, kind of a space agey kind of blur, but have the runner mostly, or theoretically mostly, in focus, right? And so that's what gives you that ability. Now you still have to match that with your exposure. You can't, if I was not paying attention, if you notice my screen is like completely blown out. So if I was a sunny day and I'm shooting at these crazy low shutter speeds to get a motion blur, there's a really good chance that I'm going to have quite a bit of a mess when it comes to exposure, right? So from an artistic standpoint, you kind of got to balance things out. You got to decide whether you're going for that kind of motion blur, or whether you want to try to eliminate that altogether and go up to a faster shutter speed. If we're like 1/500th of a second, right? I go quick along, and if you notice, it's so fast that it almost catches, almost blurless. Now, like I said, if I zoom here to check on this, right, there is a little bit of blur still because I was going quite fast, but it's also more of like an aberration of the fact that we're at 6400 ISO, and it's not as crystal clear of an image as you would have at a lower ISO rating. So that kind of is one of the two situations, I guess you could say, in which you would want your shutter speed to be your priority. The other time, or sorry, no, those are the two. Whether you need more light or less light is one. So the amount of light, and or whether you're capturing motion and stuff, right? So your shutter speed needs to be your priority, whether you are capturing fast or slow, like fast motion, or whether you want motion blur. That has to be your priority, is shutter speed. As well, if you're shooting in low light situations. So if I'm doing like astrophotography or trying to capture like light painting and stuff, definitely super important to have a slow shutter speed and be able to control the time to which the shutter speed is open, and the aperture and the ISO are important, but not as important. So for those above 2 situations, right? If I'm trying to capture fast motion, I'm going to want a super fast shutter speed, right? So we're talking 1/500 or 1/1000 or something, right? So for question 12, for the above 2 situations, so question 10, the 2 situations are capturing fast motion or low light situations, and for 12, you want a fast shutter speed, so 1/500, 1/1000, 1/600, whatever it is. That's a fast shutter speed for capturing those fast motions. But if it's a low light scenario and you need to slow things down, now you're going with a shutter speed of like 1 second or longer. I've done exposures that are 30 seconds or a minute, depending on how little amount of light I have and how much light I need to let in for it to expose properly. Okay. So you're going to take or find 2 more photos, one that has a long exposure or slow shutter speed, and another one that has a fast exposure / fast shutter speed, and then just label those appropriately. And then the last sort of section here is describing ISO. So we all, from our previous worksheet and stuff, know that ISO is the International Standards Organization, and it relates to how sensitive your camera sensor, whether it's in here, whether it's in here, or whether it's in my cell phone, it doesn't make any difference. It all relates to the same sort of sensor effectiveness in terms of how quickly it responds to light. With digital cameras, it's all algorithms and kind of fake. If we were using film photography, ISO would directly relate to the speed of the film, so how detailed the film is, right? An ISO of 100 gives you very crisp, very specific, detailed images, but it's a very slow ISO. It's a very slow film, so it would take a lot of light and a lot of time to expose correctly, right? In comparison, ISO 1600 or 6400, like we were using, is a very quick exposure. You cannot see this worksheet. Hang on. Try that. There we go. Sorry about that. 11, 12, 13. I apologize. I was explaining them and looking at my one monitor. Hopefully it all still makes sense. Anyways, ISO with regards to the camera sensor, right, is that sensitivity. It's how sensitive your camera's sensor is to light, or at least the implied sensitivity. The sensor is always the same sensitiveness. It's just how the computer inside the camera is teaching that sensor. Either you want to go slow and let in lots of light and be super detailed, or quick and not as important for detail, and we're going to let in some aberrations and stuff as you go really fast, right? So that ISO, like we discussed earlier, can definitely affect your detail in a photo. So we're going to kind of go back to this plant demo thing here. I'm going to turn this light and see if I can get a little more light on this plant here, so I don't have to have quite the amount of flash and stuff. So if I chose to take pictures of this flower again, so we're going to go back to here. So we got our plant. Line this up. Take a nice, get that in focus. So I am going to shoot this. I'm going to put it into manual mode, and I'm going to set the settings myself. I am going to set my ISO to 100. So I want the most, what I would consider the most detailed image. I know that this camera doesn't shoot super well at f2.8, so I'm going to go a little faster with that, and then I'm going to slow my shutter speed down to get a proper, or what the computer thinks is a proper exposure. So if I take this photo now, hang on, I need my, okay, so Obviously I had to shoot very slowly, so it was at 1/4 of a second. Um, and that's obviously not very practical. If this was a fast object, it's clearly a plant sitting on a desk, so it's okay if we go slowly. Now I will change my ISO now all the way up to 3200. I'm going to leave my aperture the same at 3.5, but I'm going to have to obviously go much faster with my shutter speed to get a similarly exposed photo. So now if I push play and I zoom in a little bit here, so this is the 3200 ISO. So we have a nice picture of some plant petals and stuff, but there is a little bit of like kind of this weird fuzziness you get to the image. If we go back now to this other image that was taken just before this one, that was the ISO 100. When I zoom in, you still get some detail blur, but the amount of like distortion, if you will, is much less. Right now it's just a soft focus and it looks more natural, but you generally get a really nice clean crisp image using that smaller ISO. So that kind of describes how ISO can really help control the detail in your photo. Obviously the advantages and disadvantages are a little bit obvious, in the sense that one of the advantages is that even in low light scenarios, you can really have a lot of light coming into your images, and you're able to take photos even in a very dark environment, in a very crappy environment. But the downside to that is obviously that you lose, or you have the potential to lose, quite a bit of quality when you are cranking your ISO way up high, right? So the advantage is also kind of the disadvantage of ISO with regards to that. Let's see here. A couple other things that are not really mentioned in here, but are still somewhat important, if you will, is to keep in mind like white balance, and even there's a term called exposure compensation. And what that is like in your cameras, you can tell the camera, I understand it's a really bright scene right now, but I don't want you to expose for what you think is the right exposure. I'm going to tell you to purposely expose 1 stop or 2 stops less than it should be. We use that exposure compensation when we do HDR photography. We create those bracketed exposures. One of the things, actually I won't talk about it now. You guys can remind me later to talk about HDR photography when I'm not recording this, because it has nothing to do with this right now. So disadvantages, advantages, detail. Let's see here. So describe the photographic triangle. So to kind of recap, we have this imaginary thing called the photographic triangle. Now I could Google it and find you a demo and stuff like this, but essentially we're talking about our aperture, our shutter speed, and our ISO, and the 3 of them relate to how we are going to generally how we're going to think about our photos, right? So as our shutter speed gets either faster or slower, it's gonna push and pull on the other 2 elements of that triangle, right? Generally, as a photographer, whether I'm wanting an artistic, ambient, or kind of depth of field, aperture priority photo, or whether I want a super fast shutter speed priority photo, I'm still generally going to keep in mind or set my ISO first. So I'm either going to make a decision like, I don't care what the ISO is, I'm just going to let the camera do it, so I might put it on auto, or I'm specifically going to say, no, I need these to be high quality photos. So if I'm doing portraits of somebody, I'm going to put it on like ISO 100, And I still might use shutter speed or aperture priority, but I'm telling the computer in the camera, don't you dare move off of 100 ISO. I don't care if it's underexposed. I would rather have you be at 100 ISO. If I am sending it out with a rookie photographer, I don't care as much about the ISO, especially if I know that I can put the picture super small in a yearbook, but I need to be able to capture that moment regardless of what the lighting is. I'm going to let the camera choose the ISO because it'll just push it up high enough to still get a good or reasonably good exposure. So ISO is the first one that I always think about. I sometimes will set it at a fixed amount. Other times I'll leave it as auto because I don't care as much. Then I'm determining what type of scenario I am in. Am I in a fast motion? People are moving, people are talking, so I need shutter speed to be my priority. Or am I in a more artistic scenario where things are moving slower and I want to play with that depth of field and be creative and allow that artisticness to come out, right? So I would do either aperture priority or TV priority. Program mode on your camera, so the P on your cameras, is allowing the computer in the camera to choose both the shutter speed and the aperture. That can be very helpful if you're just kind of taking snapshots, you're doing a lot of run and gun stuff, with the exception that if you put it on program mode and you have a low light scenario, all of a sudden you go inside and it gets really dark. If it's not able to change your ISO to go really, really high, it will automatically take your shutter speed and drop it below 1/60th, like way into the slow numbers, and you won't be able to handhold the camera anymore. So you really need to watch how that triangle really, really adapts and moves, right? I usually set my ISO or think about my ISO first, and then I will determine those shutter speed or aperture values depending on what type of scenario I am in. And then from there, it's a little bit of experimenting. As you increase one, you might have to adjust the other. Maybe you set a fixed aperture because you know you want that narrow depth of field. Well, you may need to go really fast with your shutter speed or really slow with your shutter speed depending on what's going on. If I'm outside but I want a narrow depth of field at like 2.8, I'm going to be shooting at like 1/5000th of a second sometimes because it's just so much light outside. Even at ISO 100, the sunlight on a sunny day is so bright compared to in a studio like this with one little light and a couple roof lights or whatever. We're shooting way slower than we would if I took the same plant outside and shot it on a snowy white day like it is today. So hopefully that explains the photographic triangle. The last thing would be exploiting the camera's light meter. So we'll pop back to this full screen view here. So in the bottom middle, you have a series of numbers. It looks like a -3 to +3, and as I change my shutter speed, you can see a little ticker moving back and forth. So that display is the light meter display. So you're going to need to draw or find a little graphic picture. You can just Google it and stick it in there for question 18 as to what that looks like. But when you're explaining the camera's light meter, it's basically the meter that allows you to know when the camera feels the scene is properly exposed. So you need to change your shutter speed, aperture, ISO accordingly to get the tick to line up in the middle. Now, you can confuse the light meter really easily with having dark objects versus light objects. So right now it's pointing at my messy desk, which has a darker black kind of iPad on it. If I all of a sudden turn the camera towards my computer screen and there's a white computer screen, notice how the tick goes right off the chart. It goes way into the +3 values there. So it thinks it's like completely overexposed, and it probably is with these settings, right? But if you were out on a sunny day and you had somebody that you were taking a picture of with a black t-shirt, but it was really sunny outside, it might be confused and it might make your picture brighter than it should be, thinking, or excuse me, darker than it should be, thinking, well, it's bright out here, and this area that I'm pointed at is dark, so we need to get more bright. We need to have more light going on. Except it's already a really light day, so now you have this blown out, overexposed photo. Not good. The converse is the same though, that you have a darker kind of dusk scenario, and you're shooting somebody with a white t-shirt on, and if the camera gets confused with the white t-shirt, it's going to make everything so much darker because it's trying to get the white to expose properly. So you need to know when to trust your light meter and when to say, nope, I don't care if you're 1 stop under or 2 stops under. It's just a reference point for you. It's not a be all end all. Always the tick has to be in the middle. Okay. The way to start your light meter, I'm going to flip this around. So I'm going to put me up here and this one in the corner. The way to get the light meter to move is to hit your trigger halfway. Don't take a picture, just push it halfway. And then now when I scroll, you can see that light meter moving back and forth there, right? In this camera, there you can set it in the menu. There's a timeout setting, like, because the light meter does waste battery, right? When it's engaged. So now if you notice it stopped, the little tick went away. If I push the button halfway down again, it'll re-engage the light meter, and now I can set my settings accordingly to be able to see what's going on there. So so you're going to do that, and then the last part of this assignment is you're going to take 6 photos that demonstrate good exposure, but also like just good photos in general, and these are the ones that you have to take them. So for question 20, you must take 6 photos at least. I don't care if they were taken with a cell phone or an iPad or whatever. It doesn't change the fact that you need to have good exposure. You need to understand sort of what aspects were important with the exposure triangle. If you are using your cell phone and an iPad versus a SLR camera, you're not going to have as much control. So you need to make wise decisions. If you want to take a photo that has a narrow depth of field with a cell phone, it can be done, and you can use kind of portrait mode to fake it, or you can selective focus, but the rules still remain that if you are in a super bright scenario, it's going to give you way clearer pictures, nicer, more options, right? If you're backlit, if you have the plant sitting in front of a window and you're shooting towards the window, it's going to be a crappy photo no matter what. It's going to be very hard to get that plant to look nice. If you turn around the other way and you have the window lighting your plant or your chair or whatever it is you're taking a picture of, and you're shooting not in the way of the window, don't block the light from the window, but if you're using the light, so you're up against the window using its light to take the photo, you're going to get lots of light on your subject, and it's going to give you a great amount of options to take photos that have artistic elements to them. Okay, obviously if you have a studio and you want to have fun with lights, or you want to take some photos that are long exposure, if you have a camera that you can put on a tripod, be creative. These 6 photos are yours to take. They're of anything you want to take. There's no sort of rules. I mean, there's rules. It has to be appropriate for school. I don't want to see inappropriate photos, but you need to take good photos. Enjoy taking those photos. And specifically, these 4 questions need to be answered for each photo. So you will post your photo into here, and then underneath you're going to obviously, you can copy these questions and paste them 6 times, or you can just paste the answers. I don't really care how you format the document, but you need to ask, are they properly exposed images? The comment is like, yes, it's a properly exposed, or I exposed it under for this reason, or I overexposed it for this reason, right? So it doesn't have to be a perfect exposure. What it has to be is a perfectly explained exposure. I don't care even if you got it wrong, even if you took a picture and you're like, actually 5 of these are great and the 6th one sucks, but if you explain what happened, that's what I am marking. I am marking the thought process behind the photos. You actually don't get a mark for the 6 photos. I don't actually care. You get a mark for the 6 descriptions of the photos, right? Technically you get 2 marks for each, but whatever. Are they properly exposed images, right? Is it properly exposed? What aspects of the triangle, of the triangle was most important to the success of the photo? So was it a fast photo that you needed a fast shutter speed, or was it a slow photo that you were concerned more about depth of field? What aspect, right? ISO probably not going to factor in. This question's more talking about aperture or shutter speed. Now ISO might play a factor in there in the sense that you were saying it was really dark, so I went with a slow shutter speed and a big aperture, but I wanted it to be good quality, so I kept my ISO low. That's a good thought process. Probably not. It's probably reading a little deeper into it. And then how did composition rules help with the arrangement of the photo? So did you even look at the composition of the photo? Is it a really weird, awkward photo? Or did you actually think about it and use rule of thirds, or use balance, or use some sort of leading lines and do something artistic and creative with the photos, right? And then what did you have trouble with taking these photos? So you still may have pulled it off. The photo still may have worked, but you might have said, well, I wanted to take this picture of a plant and have this little robot figurine sitting in front of it, but I couldn't get the light right, or I kept making a shadow on the robot, so then I had to wait till later in the day, or I needed to get a white piece of paper and reflect some of the light back onto the robot guy so he wasn't so shadowy, right? There's lots of different ways to solve problems, and that's what that specific question is asking about, is what issues did you have? What did you think about? What was the thought process behind taking the photo? And then we go from there. So I know that this assignment is a big deal, and it will take you a little while to potentially go back through my video and to find any answers that you missed. It's also going to take you some time to take I think it's 12, 6, 2 is 8, 12, 14, 18 photos. Okay, it's going to take you some time to take or find those 18 photos for the overall assignment. Plus, obviously, answer all the other questions as best as you possibly can. So I have set the due date for this for Friday, knowing that you don't have a ton of time left today. You're going to have a chunk of time tomorrow, and then you'll have all of Friday's class to work on this particular worksheet. The 2 assignments, this is probably doesn't, hang on, I'm going to stop recording here for a second. So that's it. Does anyone have any questions actually before I stop recording? Is there anything I can answer specific to this assignment that you may have missed? There's something you want me to review, something that didn't make sense? I see some of you have turned your cameras off. I would assume you're going to turn them back on. Any questions? Anything goes with regards to this. Nothing? There's got to be some questions. I'm sure somebody has a question. Nothing? Oh. Okay, yep. So, obviously you can go back and watch the video later if this second doesn't quite make sense. But basically, ISO controls it in the sense that at ISO 100 or at a low ISO, you have a very crisp, detailed photo. If you have it at ISO like 6400, you start to get like fragmenting and different kinds of, they call it grain or noise in your photo. So lower quality cameras, cheaper cameras, the noise factor gets very high at the high ISO. Expensive cameras, you get grain, and it can be very kind of artistic-y, cinematic, and it adds to that kind of old, rich feel of a photo. But the noise is like these weird little like blue and green and red dots that start to appear in your photo, because with digital photos everything is kind of manipulated and stuff. And so at the higher ISO you lose that detail in your photos. I did a little demo on the deal, took a picture of this plant at both a high and low ISO. So when I post this video, you can go back and take a look at that and get a little bit clearer details about the different examples there. So hopefully that answers that, Julianne. Anybody else? Nobody else? Nothing? Okay, I will stop recording